have with us Scott Keeter, who is the Director of Surveys at the Pew Research Center. Scott has been with Pew for the past 12 years. However, he's been a consultant with Pew for the past 20 years, so full-time there for 12. Prior to joining Pew, he was a professor of political science at Virginia Commonwealth, George Mason, and Rutgers University. We also have with us tonight Cliff Zukin, who is also a pollster of note. He started the Star Ledger Eagleton Rutgers poll, where he is currently a professor of political science and public policy. Both gentlemen are the past presidents of APOR, which is the American Association for Public Opinion Research, which is the organization of note for pollsters. And like I said, both bring with them lifetimes of experience in the polling world. And before I turn it over to them to talk about polling in an ideologically divided world and the midterm elections, I would just say that it's a rare honor that I'm able to introduce two people who I have the highest respect for professionally, who I've learned a tremendous amount from, but who I can also call my friends, and co-authors on a book that we once wrote together. So they've been mentors, they've been friends of mine, and I'm just delighted that they're here with us this evening. So with that, I will simply remind you to also please silence your electronics, and I will turn it over to, I believe, Cliff. You're going first? No, Scott. Scott, okay. So thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Krista. It's a real delight to be here tonight, and I appreciate the invitation. I think it's fair to say that Cliff and I have the very highest regard for Krista for the work that she did with us when we were working on the new engagement book, and then I've watched her career develop here at Fairleigh Dickinson University and directing the Public Mind poll, where she's doing great things. So I'm really thrilled to have the opportunity to share the stage with you as well. So Cliff and I are going to do a little tag team here. I'm going to beat you down as much as possible, and then I'm going to give him the tag, and he's going to come into the ring and deliver a little more punishment. And hopefully it won't be too bad, but we are talking about the election, which is right around the corner, and we're talking about a phenomenon that has become more and more prominent in our politics, and that's the phenomenon of political polarization. It's a subject that we at the Pew Research Center have studied in great detail, particularly over the past year. I'll tell you a little bit about how we've gone at it and sort of what our approach has been. My talk is going to be, there are going to be a lot of numbers in it, but everything is done with graphs, and so hopefully that'll make it a little bit more palatable. Let me preview what I'd like to do in my segment here in the beginning, and try to be relatively brief so that both Cliff will have an opportunity to speak to you tonight, and that you'll have a chance to ask us questions as well. So I want to do 5 basic things. One is I want to describe to you the nature of and the extent to which the American public has become politically polarized over the past 20 years or so. This has taken the form of both divisions in terms of ideological viewpoints, personal and political values, but also just in terms of animosity towards people who do not share your views on politics. That too has grown. I'll say a little bit about whether there are any good things about polarization. There's a lot of talk that polarization is bad, and in the main it probably is, but there may be 2 sides to the question. The second thing I want to talk about is the fact that in a polarized political world like we live in, the fundamentals underlying the election, the choices that voters are going to make next week, have been in place for months, maybe even for years, and that there is a great deal of predictability to political behavior in the United States that makes us sometimes wonder why we spend so much time and energy focusing on campaigns, because campaigns ultimately just move things around the margins. Of course, the secret there is that the margins often matter. But a lot of what's going to happen Tuesday is in the can, as they say. The third thing is that part of the surprise and why we don't really know what's going to happen next Tuesday is that the real question in elections is who's going to show up to vote, and not so much how people are going to vote. If we know much about people, we know how they're going to vote. but we have a lot less information and a lot less certainty about whether they in fact are going to vote. The fourth thing that I'll talk about is the fact that while the fundamentals, the things that people believe about politics, greatly influence the choices that they make, there are a lot of other factors that are in play in any election cycle, and I think in this one in particular there's some very interesting things going on. And I think both Cliff and I are going to talk a little bit about the wild cards that aren't just about the choices and the preferences and the ideology of people. And then finally, I'll just get into the details a little bit. It seems like this is a really good year for the Republicans. The president's unpopular. The health care law is, on balance, unpopular. The contests, particularly for the Senate, are being held in Republican states or states that voted Republican in previous presidential elections. And yet there isn't a certainty that the Republicans are going to sweep on Tuesday. They certainly will likely do well, but will they get all of the flags that they want to capture? And I'll say a little bit about why there's this uncertainty. So let me first turn to the question of polarization. What do we mean by polarization? I think the term implies that people are going off in different directions. And in fact, we can actually show that when we think about the way people think about politics. So in a typical telephone survey that we do at the Pew Research Center, we ask people a series of questions about where they stand on issues and about their political values. Do they think that poor people have it easy because the government gives them things and they don't have to do anything in return? Or do poor people have it hard because they face all kinds of obstacles to finding work or whatever? Well, that's a stark choice, but most people kind of lean one way or the other. We ask people if they think that good diplomacy is the best way to achieve peace, or is military strength the best way to achieve peace? Again, a tough choice, but a philosophical distinction that good solid Democrats or Republicans can probably make fairly easily. So we ask a bunch of these questions, and then we try to see, well, what if you took all of these questions in combination? Are people consistently liberal or consistently conservative across these? So what I'm showing up here is the extent to which the public falls into consistently conservative viewpoints, liberal over on the left, or consistently conservative viewpoints over on the right. And we did this survey in '94, again 10 years later, and again this year. And the percentage of people who are occupying these little wings out here has steadily grown over this period of time. Now, from the looks of this, the numbers of people who are consistently liberal or conservative is still a very small minority of the total public. If you put in the mostly liberal and the mostly conservative people, then you're getting up to a majority of the public that take a recognizable left or right position. And the way these mountains are built is basically you have 10 questions in this scale, and you can be a plus 10 if you're entirely conservative, you can be a minus 10 if you're entirely liberal, or you can be somewhere in between if you've had a mix of points of view. And the size of the mixed group, as you can see, has dropped 10 points over this period of time. And then this is just sort of piling the people on top of each other to make the mountain. So we think about this as a kind of normal distribution in the statistical world. Now, let's add in the element of partisanship here. Let's take people who say that they're Democrats or Republicans, or lean Democratic or lean Republican, and map them again by the consistency of their ideological views. So let's start separately with the Republicans. And so back in 1994, you can see that 64% of Republicans in that poll were more conservative than the average Democrat at that time in 1994. Today, 92% of Republicans are more conservative than the average Democrat. Well, is that because conservatives have gotten more, is that because Republicans have gotten more conservative, or is it because Democrats have gotten more liberal? And the answer is both. Because if you do the same thing with the Democrats, you see that now, compared with 10 years ago or 20 years ago, the size of the mountain to the left of the average Republican is much bigger. So now we have the parties almost entirely separated ideologically, with 92% of the Republicans to the right of the average Democrat and 94% of Democrats to the left of the average Republican. So put those two things together, and this is what the mountains look like. The blue is the Democrats, the red is the Republicans, and the purple, if it looks purple on this screen, is the overlap. And you can see that the size of the overlap has shrunk as the parties have moved right in the case of the Republicans and left in the case of the Democrats. And so we're talking about average Americans and the consistency of their thinking and how that maps onto the partisan world. In 1994, you had a lot more conservative Democrats, you had a lot more liberal Republicans than you do today. Today, there's no room in either party for someone who doesn't share the ideological views. And that's certainly the case from the point of view of many people who have been leaders in the parties, who've been legislators. You hear the laments, particularly from members of the Senate, the liberal Republicans who used to serve in the Senate, or the conservative Democrats. They feel like there isn't room for them in their delegations any longer. The problem, if this is a problem, is exacerbated by the fact that the people who are the most engaged in politics are the ones who have moved and congealed around their ideological homes most distinctly. So these charts are the same ones I just showed you, except what we've done is we've taken the people who are highly politically engaged, really interested in politics, frequently vote, and do other things in campaigns as well. And again, you see in 1994 there was a lot of overlap, the red and blue mountains, in terms of this ideological consistency scale were very well mixed up here. And by 2014, it looks like some canyon in the Rocky Mountains. There is this giant chasm in the middle of our politics among the most active citizens. So this is what I mean by the point that the country has become more ideologically polarized, and it has become more polarized in partisan terms as well. We've had a shift in ideology, but we've also had a mapping of people's ideology onto their partisan identities much more cleanly than has been true in the history of modern polling. Now, there's another element to polarization that's important, and it goes hand in hand with ideological polarization, and that is partisan antipathy. These are graphs showing the percentage of Democrats who have a very unfavorable opinion of the Republican Party and the percentage of Republicans who have a very unfavorable attitude towards the Democratic Party. And over this 20-year period, the numbers, as you can see, have more than doubled. And these are people who really, really, really don't like the people in the other party. We felt like this particular question might not be getting us quite where we wanted to go, so we actually went on and asked people who have very unfavorable opinions of the other party, well, do you think that the Republicans or the Democrats, depending on who we were talking with, are so misguided that their policies threaten the nation's well-being? And so among all Democrats, 27% hold that view. Among all Republicans, 36% hold that view. But among the very politically engaged Republicans, it's over half. And it's almost half among very politically engaged Democrats. And among the most consistently conservative Republicans, it's 2/3. So in this environment where you believe that the other party is simply not just wrong, but a real threat to the country, you can imagine that it's going to be difficult to find avenues of compromise. And indeed, that has been the history of our politics of late. Now, the way I'm talking about this, it sounds like I've prejudged that polarization is all a bad thing. But I would like to at least mention the fact that there was a movement in the political science world about 40 years ago towards the idea of having more responsible parties. The notion that if the parties stood for something and if they were consistent and you could depend on them if they got into power to do what they said that they would do, then theoretically the citizen would have more power, because if you like the Republicans and you vote for the Republicans and they win control of the presidency and the Congress, then they will have their policies enacted, and then the public will have the chance to judge those policies at the next election. And so we are living in an era of responsible parties, much more so than was the case when the political scientists began talking about this 40 years ago. So in that sense, the public has more control, but there certainly isn't the sense on the part of the public that they do, in part because of the division, the even division in our politics right now that seems to make it impossible for either side to capture that kind of complete control. So I said that the second thing I wanted to talk about was the fact that the fundamentals of the election seem to be already in place. You have so many people whose ideological positions are so solid that, and their vote choices are very much corresponding to those ideological positions, that you kind of know how almost everybody's going to vote before you hold the election. This is a little graph that just shows what happened with people that we interviewed, first in a telephone survey to produce the mountains that I showed you, and then again later in a panel that we put them into in June, and then we interviewed them at the end of last month. And 91% of the people who were supporting a Republican candidate for the House of Representatives in June are still supporting a Republican candidate. 92% of those who are supporting a Democratic candidate are still supporting a Democratic candidate. And there's been no significant movement towards either party. It just sort of, it's a wash, it's a wash. And some of this could even be just, mistakes in answering the questions. So the only thing where you can see where there's been some change is the people who were not picking a Republican or a Democrat in June have now, about half of them have chosen either a Republican or a Democrat, but it's about an even divide. So there is a little bit of wiggle room in the electorate, but a lot of it is kind of locked in. I mentioned, though, that the real question is who's going to show up to vote. And here the Republicans have a definite edge, because Republicans and conservatives are more likely to vote in a low stimulus election like a midterm election. So one way to look at this is using a variety of measures that we ask people about their likelihood of participating in their past behavior. We find that 73% of the people that we judge as consistently conservative in their ideological views are going to show up to vote next week, or maybe have already voted absentee. Their counterparts on the liberal side, only 58% we deem as likely to vote. And so that advantage for conservatives, which also shows up in the mostly conservatives at 52% turnout versus 32% among the people who are mostly liberal in their views, is the reason why the Republicans seem to have an edge in a lot of the polls, particularly when you look kind of nationally. This pattern is associated with a lot of things. The demographics of the voters, older voters tend to be more conservative and that kind of thing. But this is why, even though we actually have more people who have liberal attitudes in the poll than have conservative, the conservatives are going to be a bigger force on election day in general, than not in every place, obviously. So if it were just this point, this ideological point that I've talked about, we might say we know what's going to happen next week, but we don't, because there are a number of wild cards. So I think it's worth going through a few of these. I think Cliff is going to talk a bit about this as well. But one thing is, public is really unhappy with the quality of leadership in the country right now. It's not just unhappiness with President Obama, although he's taking his licks for sure, but it's unhappiness with Congress. Congress has the lowest approval ratings in the history of modern polling right now. And so you get a series of questions like this going back to 1994, do you want to see your representative reelected? Do you want to see most representatives reelected? And the answer is no, and we got the highest percentage that we've ever gotten on both of these questions. Now, the question about your own representative is 35%. That's the biggest number we've ever gotten, but that's not a majority, and that gives you a hint. Most people are going to get reelected next week, even though the sentiment of the country seems very strongly to replacing in a wholesale fashion much of the current political class. That has implications maybe not for the House of Representatives, where most people are in safe seats, but it might have big implications for governorships or for the Senate races that are so hot. A second factor that we want to make sure we understand, and is certainly tied to the anti-incumbency feelings, is the fact that there is a persistent kind of unhappiness about the state of the economy. Cliff will say more about this in the way it's actually affecting people, but this number is an interesting one. This is the percentage of people over the past 6 years who've told us they think the economy is in excellent or good condition. And I mean, the line is getting up off the floor, but it's not getting up very high. And so the percentage of people who think the economy is in poor shape remains at about a third, and only fair at about 45%. So there's a slight hint of an improvement here, but on the whole, people are really unhappy. That's never good for incumbents. And a third factor that we have to keep in mind here is that for all of the troubles of the Democrats and President Obama, and he is a drag on the party in the eyes of a lot of people in his own party, the fact is that the Democratic Party has better public opinion than the Republican Party. The unfavorables for the Republican Party are at 54%, only at 47% for the Democrats. Now, this is not a profile of popularity by any means, but compared with the Republicans, which have been very unpopular for the past several years, the Democrats are in better shape, and that's one reason why it's kind of unpredictable what's going to happen. So let me turn quickly to the elections and just say a couple of things, and then in the Q&A, if you'd like to talk about some specific races or some of the details, I'd be happy to. One of the places where we really don't know what's going to happen and where anti-incumbency is apt to override the forces of polarization and people's being locked into their positions is showing up in the governor's races in a lot of big states. This should be a pretty good year for Republicans, but it's not a good year for incumbents, and incumbents got elected. The incumbents running this year were elected in 2010 in a similar climate of unhappiness by the public. And so you have places like Florida where the governor is in a dead heat with his Democratic opponent. In Georgia, where the unemployment rate is the highest in the country. In Wisconsin, where Governor Scott Walker is fighting for his career and his possible presidential prospects going forward. And in Kansas, where a very conservative and Republican state, where the governor, by the view of a lot of people, overreached in cutting taxes and cutting public services. And there is a chance that a Republican governor in Kansas might lose, which is amazing. And so you have a lot of very interesting races around the country where incumbency is not a good thing if you happen to have presided over the last 4 years with the economy. The Senate is also interesting and actually is attracting more attention, I think, than the governorships from at least the sort of national political press corps, because all of these gray states are states where there's essentially a dead heat between the Democrat and the Republican. And here, it's the Democrats who have the problem because they have the most seats up in terms of their incumbents. And so places like Louisiana, where Mary Landrieu is likely to be forced into a runoff and likely to lose a runoff based on the current polling, that's a tough place. Same in Arkansas and over in Colorado. But look at Kansas, another state where the Republicans ought to be able to count on doing well there, and they can't. and in Georgia, where a Democrat might be able to win because of unhappiness with the Republicans. North Carolina is another example of this. And even Mitch McConnell, the Senate minority leader, who would be the majority leader if the Republicans were able to take the Senate, might not be there to see it. He's leading in the polls, but it's still very close. Let me leave you with this fact. I hate to do this because it's not, my view is that the public is very rational and makes good choices for the most part, and it's unhappy right now, and there's a reason for it to be unhappy. And the kind of connection between people's values and their vote choice is very strong. People are not irrational in how they vote. But the fact is, a lot of people don't know very much. And you'd think right now that the public would understand what the partisan alignment in Congress is, but the fact is that only 43% of registered voters that we interviewed are aware that the Republicans have a majority in the House of Representatives and that the Democrats have a majority in the Senate right now, which is kind of the fundamental question about who's responsible for what's going on in the government, and less than half of registered voters know that. So it's always worth keeping in mind that politics is not the #1 thing for most people in America. They don't pay nearly as much attention to it as my guess is you or we do. And we have to keep that in mind when we're trying to make sense of what the voters are doing. Thank you. I'll turn it over to Cliff.
I'm going to talk about the 2014 elections from a bit of a different perspective. I want to talk about the political climate and the economic climate. And Krista mentioned the book that we all wrote together, A New Engagement. And that was mainly about young people. And I want to try and return to that theme too also, but in the context of the election. Here's where we were when we wrote the book. And since then, we've all gone our separate ways. Krista got a PhD and got a job at Fairleigh Dickinson. Scott went into the Pew Research Center. And I hung around Rutgers, but I changed what I do a lot starting in 2008. I went to work for the Heldrick Center for Workforce Development. It was run by a very good friend of mine, Carl Van Horn, and he needed help with survey work. I knew almost nothing about workforce development, but I thought I could help him on the survey side. So I've been doing that for 6 years now, and it really was an education, because what happened in 2008 is that we lost 10 million jobs. And one of the studies that I did, and actually one of Scott's slides about the rating of the economy as excellent or good, it was 21%, I think, in 2007, and then in 2008 it was 4%. I mean, you just saw the whole thing go. One of the things I did was to do a four-way panel study. We followed 1,000 unemployed people through the recession, starting in 2009, 2010, 11, and 12. And it was the most depressing survey I've ever worked on, as the number of people who said they borrowed money from family and friends, who had moved in with other people, who had sold possessions to make things meet, went up and up and up. We also did a survey of recent college graduates, people who had gone out of college into the recession but had been out for 1 to 5 years. And we also did a survey of recent high school graduates. And I'm going to talk about all of those a little bit today. But I am going to talk about the election and the political and economic climates. I agree with everything Scott has said about polarization, and what I'm going to say builds on that. There was a mention of something that I found very interesting in your David Brooks column in the last week, where he compared a poll taken in 1960 that asked people if they would be upset if their son or daughter married a person of the other party. And it was 5%. The poll this year finds 50% of Republicans, and they would be very upset if their kid married a member of the other party, and 33% of Democrats, including my wife, who would be very upset if one of our kids married a member of the other party. But it is more than polarization. That's really where I want to start. It's a lot more than polarization. It won't be resolved in the 2014 election. In fact, it could get very much worse over the next 2 years. And when we put out this last poll that we did around Labor Day, I did an interview with the NewsHour, and they were asking me questions that got me to thinking about a term, and the term I came up with was malaise. And a lot of you were senior enough to remember this is a Jimmy Carter term when he spoke to the country about going through malaise. And a malaise is an uneasiness, it's unsettling, and I think we're there. I think we're there in terms of people's personal lives, that they don't know what's going to happen next and they're fearful. I think that their government is performing worse than it ever has, and they can't look to government for solutions. They don't think there's help there anymore. We're a very, very long way away from where we were just as recently as 2008. I mean, in 2008, I was working on an election exit poll. I don't know if you know this, but there's just one exit poll, and then it gets labeled as the NBC election poll, the CBS election poll, the ABC election poll, the CNN election. And there's just one, and it's done in Somerville, New Jersey. And I was working in 2008 there that night. And I remember all of us very hardened political observers and professional neutrals stood and looked at the country that had just elected its first black president and felt very, very good, and felt that this was a new age and that we had gone through a change in our politics, and it was fresh. And that lasted about a few months. There's a book out called Do Not Ask What Good We Do by Robert Draper, and it was about the House of Representatives. And in the preface to the book, he writes that on the inauguration day of 2009, when hundreds of thousands of people came in to Washington to witness the Obama inauguration, there were 15 Republicans that went out for dinner. Eric Cantor, Paul Ryan, Newt Gingrich, Frank Lutz, Jim DeMint, who was a senator, now runs the Heritage Foundation, Senators Bob Corker, John Ensign, and others. And what they decided to do at that dinner is to plot a way forward. And the way forward was going to be to deny Obama anything and everything. That they were going to be united and have an unyielding opposition. And we know that there was not a single Republican who voted for the vote stimulus. Can there not be one person who thought that was good public policy? And what the Republicans did, starting then, is to oppose everything. And I have a couple quotes from that, but I don't think I'll read them to you. Just trust me on this. But it's a very good book. And Mitch McConnell came out in 2010 and said his main goal was to deny Obama re-election, 2 years down the road. And I thought that was a new watershed mark in low politics. It was the first time that people have explicitly said, on the record, not embarrassed about it, that they're rooting for failure. And that's really, really quite a leap. And I think it's a dangerous road to go on. And I think that that's what we're going to go on for the next 2 years again. I think the Republicans are going to find it very hard. They're going to, if they win the Senate, they're going to win the Senate with three very right-wing politicians, Cruz, Rubio, and Rand Paul, who are all running for president. It's going to be very much more difficult to have any sort of unity in the Senate. And I think then we're going to see more of what we have for the next 2 years. And here's why I think this is so important. And Scott's right. I mean, only 20% think the House of Representatives is doing a good job. Only 25% think the Republicans in the House are doing a good job. 30% the Democrats. We've had really a failure of the political system. And I say that because the political system has a job to do, and it's got a very important job to do. Let's see. And the job the political system is supposed to do is to solve value conflicts. The political system is where societies go to have their value conflicts adjudicated. And that's the job of the political system. And we can't live in a world where we have lower taxes and more services, right? There is, and I titled this, "We Need More," because that's the actual ballot slogan of someone who's running for the US Senate from New Jersey. That's the only information about him, is the slogan, "We need more." But in fact, we have some issues that we generally disagree on and take different sides of. Obviously, abortion for a very, very long time, immigration now too, in terms of what should be done. Most of the issues that we have, though, are what we would call valence issues, where everybody feels on one side of them. I mean, no one wants poor education, no one wants poor health. But we have conflicting values that have to be adjudicated. So in the role of government, we need to find a level of taxes and spending that we agree on. We have a trade-off usually between economic development and environmental protection. We often have trade-offs between free enterprise, and we're very much a free market country, but we know, such as the banking system, we need some government regulation. And even small things like human spaceflight. You know, do we spend $18 billion a year on that? Which we do. Would it be money better spent on the National Science Foundation that only gets $7 billion a year? But this is the job of the political system, is to resolve these conflicts. And when the conflicts don't, and so it requires compromise. It requires it. And that's the job of the system, is to compromise so that we can move forward. And what we're not doing now, because of the polarization of first the political actors, now the polarization of the public, and even now the polarization around news with CNN, with Fox News and MSNBC, you know, we have lost control to the point that the political system is not able to resolve conflicts anymore. And so that's one of the problems we have, is the political system. The other one's the economic system. And one of the things that working for a Center for Workforce Development has made me appreciate is really the importance of work. What we're seeing, I think, in the political system, is the economic system, is the failure to provide good, meaningful jobs that stretch people, that allow them to live with some security. Employment gives a lot of keys, a lot of values to people. People get a sense of identity from it and define how they go through the world by what they do. It gives meaning and purpose to people's lives. It obviously gives money and economic benefits. It allows us to plan for the future. And so when work is bad and when the economy fails to produce jobs, we have a fundamental crisis of our own spirit and also the spirit in the nation as a whole. And I think that's one of the things that has really stayed with us. And what I'm going to show you now is some slides about where people are in the last survey we did around Labor Day. We did this summer, and we released it for Labor Day. And I think the first thing to tell you is that the Great Recession really earns its name. You know, we lost 10 million jobs in 2008. It is the biggest calamity since the Depression. And you know, we didn't get those 10 million jobs back till this year. And we needed 1 million new jobs each year for us to absorb people coming, college students coming out of high schools and college. So there's been this hyper-deflation of work where college kids are taking jobs that were usually held by high school kids. And one of the things we see here is we asked people if they thought the recession was going to be a permanent change or a temporary change in what the United States had going as an economy. And when we started asking the question in November of 2009, it was evenly divided. If things had been getting better, and we know we've had 5 years of continuous growth, we hear that all the time, but if things were getting better, more people would be telling us that it was temporary. In fact, it's going completely the other way. We went from where it was a contentious matter, half on each side, to where it's a consensual matter. 70% say the changes that have happened in the American electorate and the American economy are permanent. So we titled that report Worried, Unhappy, and Pessimistic. And I'm going to show you some more slides on this on why that is. This obviously tells people, or tells us that people think that there are permanent changes, and those permanent changes are in a multitude of areas. 60% said college will never be affordable again. 55% said older people who have retired not having to work part-time is a thing of the past. 50% told us that job security is a thing of the past. These are fundamental changes in the culture. When we asked them in this year, have things gotten better or worse or stayed the same in the last year, you can see it's only about a third of people who think things have gotten better. The same number actually think things have gotten worse in the last year. When we ask them what's going to happen next year, a third tell us they think it's going to get better. But now, 5 years out of the recession, even a third think it's going to get worse. Or I'm sorry, a quarter think it's going to get worse. And there's very little hope out there. And we see this, as Scott was alluding to, in people's financial condition. What Scott put up was a graph on how people view the national economy, excellent, good, fair, poor. This is how people view their own finances. And we have 60%, 3 in 5 people in this country who say it's at best only fair, 20% flat out poor. And you look, just 7% think that they're doing, that their finances are excellent. I mean, we really have a public that has not rebounded from a recession, and it's not myth, it's not perception, it's because they don't see it in their daily life. Here's some of the impacts, some of the numbers that I think really told a good story for us. Just a massive reshaping of people's retirement plans. Almost half the people say their retirement plans have changed. 44% say they're going to retire later than they wanted. We also had 5% who said they were going to retire, they had to retire earlier than they wanted. 42% say they have less in salary and savings now. I mean, think of the number of people that is. 42% have less in savings and salary than they did 6 years ago. Just 20% said they're confident at all. Not very confident, but even some confidence about government's ability to solve the major problems that it takes on. So there's really a dearth of belief that government can function, that not even if it's well-intentioned, but if it's competent to function the way we want. We have 20% who say they're very confident, either extremely or very confident, that if they had to find a good job, that they'd be able to do it. So this is people who are currently working, and only 20% say that they could find a job, that they're confident they could find a job as good or better than the one they have now. So 80% are not confident. We have only 16% who now say jobs are going to be better for our children, for the next generation. That's down from 40% when we started going into the recession. And one of the reasons that people seem to think that life has gotten better, certainly newscast thinks that life has gotten better, is the performance of the stock market. Now, we ask people, how much does the stock market influence you personally? And only 14% said that their life was dependent a great deal on the stock market. So even there are some indicators that one would think are getting better. In fact, there's very little change in what people are seeing as their own economic condition. And I'm going to sum it up this way. We asked 2 questions. We asked, how much of a change has there been in your quality of life? And that's at the top. So people could tell us there was a major change, a minor change, or no change. And if they told us there was either a major or minor change, we asked if they thought that was going to be permanent. Are you at a new normal now? Or is this temporary and you'll get back to where you were? And because the percentages seem to me to take on a lot more weight when you actually consider it to be the number of Americans, we're saying that 38% came out of that recession devastated. There's been a major change in their quality of life and it's permanent. Another 46 million, out of 240 million adults, 46 million have been downsized, that there's been a minor change, but it's permanent. It's a new standard of living. It's a new quality of life. We have 10% who were set back, representing 24 million American adults. And that's, they had a major change, but they've recovered from it, for some of it, you know, and it's temporary. And then we've got these 53 million that we call troubled. You know, there's a minor change and it's temporary. But what we're saying here is really that only 80 million people, only 1/3 of the country came out of the Great Recession not affected by it. They came out unscathed. 2/3 came out with some sort of change in their quality of life. So, now to young people. Surveys we did of college students who've come out of four-year colleges. And I want you to, people always overestimate the number of well-educated, college-educated people, because I'll bet almost everybody here is college-educated. It's probably surprised you to know that's only 1/3 of the country graduated from a four-year degree with a four-year institution. So what I'm talking about is the cream of the American crop. These are the people who are the elites. These are the people who have a four-year college education. And only 44% of them came out of college and went into a field that related to what they studied in college very closely. And in fact, when you looked at their first jobs, only 27%, only 1 in 4 of college-educated people said, the job I've got is a career. I know where it's going. I can tell you that it's a career. And when we asked them about their second jobs, those who'd been out long enough, we found that the second jobs were in the first job they started with, not a return to what they had studied. So if you had studied sociology and you were now waiting in a restaurant, the second job was you've moved up in a restaurant. And so we have an awful lot of people out there who have spent a great deal of money, and I mean a great deal of money, for an education that they're not able to use right now. We have $1 trillion of debt, of student debt in this country now. There's more student debt than there is consumer debt in the United States right now. So of these people in four-year colleges, 2/3 took out some sort of a loan and they graduated owing money, and their average amount they owed was $20,000 to $25,000. The average job they walked into was $27,000. And then they've delayed major purchases. And only 1/4 of them have really made any significant advance on paying off these loans. So when they got out of college, that they went into debt for, only half got a full-time job. Only 40% are in positions that really require a college degree. 40% earn a lot less than expected, and half still get money from their parents. And these are the lucky ones. Those are the ones who are doing well. Take a look at the high school graduates. And there's many of them as the college graduates. Remember, this is not a small group. 27% of them are employed full-time. That's all. Just 1 in 4 have a full-time job. Half are looking for full-time work. 3 in 5 of them are in jobs that are meant to be temporary. And they get paid hourly and not a living wage. Many of them are living with their parents. So these are the young people today. And so they think that a lot of stuff is beyond them. We asked the question, you know, do you think, can you reach this goal now? Can you reach it in the foreseeable future, or not even in the foreseeable future? You know, you can't even imagine it. And among the high school graduates, half of them can't imagine having a comfortable income, having an income that affords them a comfortable life. Half can't imagine being able to afford to start a family. And 2/3 think they cannot afford to buy a house. It's a little bit better with the four-year college students, but still even 1/3 of those guys think that they're not going to be able to have enough income to lead a comfortable life in the foreseeable future. It's way down the road. And what we're going to have here is really a generation that postpones life choices. Their careers are going to be postponed. Getting married is going to be postponed. Having a family is going to be postponed. And buying a home is going to be postponed. And this is where our youth are today. And there's some interesting people here, too. I mean, you know, they have a number of qualities that are fascinating, that Krista and I and Scott and our two authors studying the book. And if I got the title slide of the book up there, we titled it A New Engagement question mark, meaning we weren't sure where they're going to go. You know, now we're 10 or 12 years later, and we've got some, you know, much better guesses on it. These guys are the most diverse and tolerant group in history. And in fact, the Gen Xers, Dr. Jenkins' group, first started being diverse and tolerant. But this is the second successive generation that's just lived it. And so they're very, very tolerant. They also don't have any firm values on things, you know, which is sort of the downside of that. They're technologically savvy, they're smart, they're fearless, they move information as quickly as you can and technologically fluent, but they don't make any distinctions between the quality of information. A refereed journal article in a library is the same as a blog post. And there's not a lot of differentiation there for that. They want a balanced lifestyle. We actually did a survey that I didn't talk to you about, but we did a survey of millennials at work, and we asked them and we asked the college students, you know, what values do you really want to have? And the top value was having a balance between work and home life. You know, it wasn't going to the top of the ladder, it wasn't being innovative, it wasn't working for an innovative company. It was having this balance. And this, I think, when we started out, we described the silent generation, people before the baby boomers. Before them, it was the you know, greatest generation of World War II. Those generations really defined by sacrifice. They wanted things to be better for their children, and they would do that. This generation is the first generation, I think, in history that thinks they're entitled to fun. You know, it is an absolute entitlement. Want to have a good time. They're good workers in the right situation, but for most of them, their work's been unfulfilling. And it's hard to see how they're going to contribute work and grow at work when they lack really opportunities. And I'm not sure what sort of workers they're going to be. I think they're going to have to make their contributions, if they do, to the Civic Engagement Bank through social activities. I don't think they're going to find it at work, and I don't think they're going to find work fulfilling. And they're so social, I think they're going to do a lot of stuff outside of work. I don't think work is going to have the same meaning to them than it has to previous generations. So, what about them as political citizens? Well, this is the turnout in the last midterm election by age. And you can see that just about a little under a quarter of those 19 to 29 actually turned out in that election. You can see that that's lower than the Gen Xers and lower than boomers and so forth. You know, we now have a second generation that is opting out of politics. Gen X was the first one, and now the millennials are the second. They don't see politics as, for them, they don't see the problems they have as political. The system not having enough good jobs. They don't see the solutions to that as political. And I don't know how to blame them. Given what we've described to you today in terms of the nature of politics and the nature of polarization, would you think they would want to do that? You know, and maybe they're right. As Scott said, people are pretty rational about how they spend their time. Maybe they've decided this is just not worth it. But I'll tell you, and here's the problem that we come full circle with. The more that people opt out of the political system, the more extreme the people who are left in it. And the more extreme the people who are left in it, then the more polarized it gets, and it feeds on itself. And that's really where we are, I think, in 2014. You know, the good news, if there is good news, is that in 2016 we get a chance to redo it. Presidential elections allow us to restart, allow us to take stock, allow us a do-over. But I think we're in for a pretty rough time over the next 2 years. And then finally then, even though there's no way out till 2016, that's for Krista. Scott and I will be happily retired on a golf course, leaving for Krista to figure out what's going on. Thanks very much.
Do we think that people, do we think that we're just getting what we're fishing for? It's a fair question and something that pollsters work very hard to make sure it doesn't happen. One of the things that we at the Pew Research Center, I think Cliff, when he was running the Rutgers Eagleton Star Ledger poll, would always do is try to look at the questions that we were writing and putting on polls from the perspective of all kinds of different actors and people from different parts of the political spectrum. What would I think if I were a conservative, if I were asked this question? Would this sound like a biased question to me? What would I think if I were a liberal of this question? And at our center, one of the things that we try to do is to have a very diverse staff of people at the table when we put questionnaires together to make sure that it's not all people with the same background and the same political views who are looking at the question, so that we actually have a diversity of political viewpoints to try to make sure that we don't have that problem. It's a big concern in polling because, you know, if in fact, as I showed in my last slide, a lot of people don't know a lot about politics, then they're going to be more susceptible to the particular words that we use in the question than they would be if they were walking around with a well established political philosophy. Not everybody walks around with a well-established political philosophy, and thus they're more vulnerable to the questions that we ask.
You didn't have a super optimist of the answer.
I was struck by the unrelenting negative and pessimistic nature of it all, and I can assure you that we are not as negative and pessimistic as we might have sounded. No, I was not going to blame you, because I wasn't exactly, you know, rays of sunshine in my talk.
I've heard this argument about polarization before, and I can't help but wonder, in a society where the electorate is so dismally ignorant of some of the basics, like who dominates which house or where New York City is it possible that the polarization has to do with the electoral sheep following the political leaders and where they're going, rather than the leaders responding to the electorate? Do you have an opinion?
Is polarization a result of the uninformed kind of blindly following the leaders? And I think there are two answers to that question, and they may sound a little contradictory. One of them is, on the face of it, it doesn't seem like that's the case, because the people who are the most ideologically consistent, the most polarized, the ones who have the strongest negative opinions about people in the other party, tend to be the best informed people in our polls. So on the face of it, it doesn't seem like that's the case. But we do see a lot of evidence that the falling into line that is the nature of what I showed with those mountains moving apart is probably a top-down phenomenon. It's driven by the kind of take no prisoners attitude that the leadership of the parties is taking with respect to their own members. And so when you, as a citizen, learn that you really shouldn't be a conservative on abortion if you're going to call yourself a Democrat, then what are you going to do? Maybe in order to stop getting criticized for that, you're going to change your opinion in some way to fall into line. And so in that sense, I think there is a top-down quality to it, even though the most polarized people tend to be the best informed and the most engaged.
It's the midterm election. We know in New Jersey that it's pretty much a one-sided race. So it's already going to be a low turnout because it's a midterm election. Then you have people thinking, well, Cory Booker doesn't need me to go out and vote. He's going to win. The Republican person running for Senate has no shot, so why should I go out and vote for him? So that's what the thought
Do you want to be honest with him? You know, and that, you know, in most towns in New Jersey, in most congressional districts, the answer would be it doesn't matter. And this relates to polarization. I mean, we have 435 races in the House of Representatives that are up, and only 10% of them are really competitive, right? Maybe 40.
Yeah, I think that's right.
And you know what happens through the country as a whole is what happened in New Jersey. In New Jersey, the Republicans and the Democrats got together and they carved up as many safe seats as they could. And they did it together, and they agreed that basically they wanted to protect all the incumbents. And so for New Jersey, it's different this year in that there's one, because of retirements and stuff like that, there may be one race that switches, but most of the districts in New Jersey are made up of 60 to 65% Democrats or 60 to 65% Republicans. And we know how much voters really don't know about issues and facts. What they do take with them into the voting booth is these partisan cues. And so Democrats vote for Democrats, Republicans vote for Republicans, and most of the seats are safe. Now, what happens when you get a safe seat? You can be ideologically as reckless as you wish to be. You don't need to compromise. If you had a constituent where maybe it was 53% Democrats and 47% Republicans, or the other way around, you would have to go to the middle to try and find some votes. And one of the problems we really have in the country, I think, is the nature of redistricting that has so many safe seats that really allows for more ideological stances.
I can't help but offer a quick answer to your question. This is maybe it's facetious, but there are some political scientists that have done experiments in which they've gone to the voter rolls and found your constituents, and they've figured out who's voted in previous elections and who hasn't, and then they've sent them letters and said, you know, your neighbors, the Johnsons over here and the Smiths on the other side, they voted in the last election, and I noticed that you didn't vote. If you don't vote in this election, I'm going to send them a letter and tell them that you didn't vote. And that apparently has the impact of, number one, making people very mad, and number two, getting them to actually turn out to vote. So if you call them on the phone and threaten to tell their neighbors if they don't show up to vote, you might get more turnout, but you also might get, you know, a dog sicked on you or something.
What's your opinion on whether that would get more age groups involved, et cetera? And I understand now with the workforce, yes, they divide on centers, they work Saturdays, they usually get one weekend. Tim, can you know whether that would get more?
Yeah, the question is if you switch voting to a weekend, if you would get more, and I think you probably would get more. I don't know if you'd get enough more to make much of a difference. I think, you know, for my money, the barriers to voting on a weekday are not, you know, if you really want to vote, usually you can do it. Right, and I think that, well, you would know this probably better than I, you know, with all the states that have early voting and so forth, has there been a large increase in turnout? Mm-hmm. Yeah, okay. Well, you should take.
Well, no, I just think the fact that you have, when you have a presidential election and you have a lot of mobilization, you have a lot more voting, and it tells me that making voting, you know, getting information to people, may be robocalls, but it may be something else, getting information to people and encouraging them to vote helps, but removing all of the barriers that you possibly could remove, including the fact that for most people, if they have a job, they have to go to work during the week. They either have to vote before they go to work or they have to vote after, and if the hours, you know, if your polls close at 7 o'clock or something like that. So I think weekend voting would help. And it would have exactly the effect that you suggested. It would probably make it easier for people who work odd hours and who different age groups, younger people. Yeah.
Yeah, and I don't think there's really a problem if you were to vote for a week. You know, I mean, I don't think it has to be a specific day. And you look at Oregon, is all vote by mail now. It's all vote by mail. Before the, yeah.
Right.
Just a follow-up question, because I know Colorado recently changed to all mail vote, Oregon and Washington. Why the hell isn't 100% voter turnout with mail-in when you just have to drop it off? I mean, what's the problem?
Well, it's not a problem, it's a realization, as Scott said, that politics is very remote from people's day-to-day lives. And I think that going back 20 years, 40 years, there was a stronger consensus that on norms of citizenship, that a good citizen votes. I don't think that's necessarily held through generational transference and replacement. So it's really a question of people feel, first, that politics is salient to their life, and second, again, the information costs. I mean, you know, I really feel for young people who don't know who to believe. Because if you look at the rhetoric of the political debate through advertisements and polarized news and even direct mail, it's very, very hard to sort, you know, where do you go to find out really what's in your interest? I don't think it's that easy a thing to do. And I don't think they're really taught how to do that either.
Most, if not all, of your figures and bar graphs imply that there was one continuum from liberal to conservative. And I'm wondering if there are any other orthogonal dimensions here. My question really comes from the European election, both for the EU and the country where I come from, Sweden. We had an election recently. And there was a great increase in people who were against immigration. There's a whole new party that has just popped up. And when you look at where those voters come from, i.e. who did they vote for in 2010, who now voted for the SD Sweden Democrats, and you find that they come from both from left and right. So this is another dimension as I interpret it. And along the same lines, it seems to me that there are two kinds of Republicans, you know, like social, religious conservatives versus more economic, international politics. So am I right that there are?
Yeah.
You talk about moralizers.
Yes. So the question is, the notion of polarization as we defined it and as the graphs that I showed you suggests that there is a left-right dimension to American politics and that everybody can be mapped along that left-right continuum. And obviously that is an oversimplification of American politics. Now, part of what was going on with this polarization where people are becoming more consistently liberal and conservative was in fact a flattening of the what we call in the business the dimensions of politics, where the social dimension around abortion and same-sex marriage, maybe even race relations, maybe even immigration, which used to have some independence from the sense of whether the government ought to help the working man out versus, you know, what's good for the country, what's good for businesses, what's good for the country. Those things are now aligning themselves much more closely in the thinking of many people in the public, but not everyone. And so to your final question, are there flavors of Republicans in particular? And the answer is absolutely yes. One of the things that we did with this survey was not just to look at people on the left-right dimension, but to see if people would group themselves based on their answers into recognizable chunks that aren't along the left-right dimension. It's a thing that we call the political typology. You can go to our website at pewresearch.org, or you can type into Google, where do you fit, and one of the links will come up and it'll be this quiz where you can take the full survey that we did. It's 23 questions, I believe, and it will tell you what group in the electorate you are most like. And there are two, if you're a conservative, there are two conservative groups, one of which is very, very ideologically consistent, and one of which has a liberal streak on social issues. We don't have anything quite like the this third dimension of the anti-immigrant group within the U.S., that right now, at least in terms of what to do about the current crop of undocumented immigrants in the United States, is the province of the Republican Party, which is taking an increasingly hard line on it. But on the social issues, you get lots of Republicans who are otherwise very faithful to the Republican Party breaking from the party on things like same-sex marriage, even legalization of marijuana and the like. And we tried to find whether there are actually people who would fit the bill of libertarians in this group, and that, you know, there's a long history of libertarianism in the United States. It's a very small group of people, we think, but they don't fit on that left-right spectrum at all. So, thank you.
I think that they do. They certainly know the public is disquieted. They absolutely know that. I think partly that it is the polarization that Scott talked about, to the point where there are some people who would rather get power than solve problems and see the other party get credit for solving a problem. I think that is really what's going on in Washington now. There are, as I mentioned, it is not one person who voted for the stimulus, the economic stimulus. I just think they can't talk. And the other thing is that they would rather have power than have things work well. And I firmly believe that's going on right now. It is.